The honourable member for North Island, Powell River.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I'm so divided right now talking about this important bill. I want to thank the member from Cumberland Colchester for bringing it forward. This bill is to create a national strategy on Aboriginal cultural property repatriation. I really appreciate the intent of the bill, and I will be supporting it. However, I am also very concerned about the weakness of the language in the bill. It says things like to promote and support the return, to encourage the owner, leaving this bill really as an option for people. Mr. Speaker, this is an important conversation that needs to happen in this country about what does it mean to be in a country where we are looking at reconciliation, when we are looking at the history of Canada and trying to move forward in a positive way. We know that the protection of cultural property touches many aspects of policy development, and this raises the risk that there could be some inconsistent things that happen and potentially even contradictory actions being taken if there is if there's no coordinating mechanism. And that is one of the biggest concerns I have for this, that there is nothing here that is actually going to move forward to deal with this very important issue. You know, I had a wise person in my riding once tell me that one of the best things about being Indigenous for him was that the history of the culture was that they didn't leave much behind. There were things like totem poles, but the actual impact on the environment was very balanced and limited. I know that for Indigenous communities across the country, their cultures are alive and active, and there are some communities that are working very hard at bringing back culture into their communities. The history of this country is that the human rights of Indigenous people have been violated and continue often to be violated. The history is that the cultural heritage has been disturbed, it's been stolen, it's been excavated, exchanged, taken under duress, and this is important when we talk about this bill. It is important to recognize that the history of Indigenous people was studied, bodies were exhumed and moved out of their territories and Canada without free, prior, and informed consent. And that's an important thing that we speak of today as we saw the passing of Bill C-262. So in this day and age of reconciliation, it must be a key part of the conversation. How are we looking at what it means for Indigenous communities to have free, prior, and informed consent? How are we looking at the history of Canada and what's happened, and how are we making things change? You know, Mr. Speaker, the University of Winnipeg, for example, currently holds the remains of 145 Indigenous people stored on their campus. This is concerning. That the remnants of the people, the first people of this country, are left in places where they are not taken care of in a proper way. In the riding that I represent of North Island Powell River, whenever remains are found, there's always a working process with the community, the Indigenous community, to make sure that those remains are treated respectfully. So when we look at this bill, we have to be looking at that as well. It makes me think of a community in my riding, the Klahoose First Nation community, who are currently undertaking to find ancestors across the world. And recently, there was an ancestor located in a Lower Mainland institution. So the community came together, worked very hard, and when it came time to transfer the ancestor from a cardboard box to the cedar box that was prepared by the Klahoose Nation, they were guided into a private room. It was an incredibly spiritual, honorable undertaking, a precious moment to return the remains, to handle them, to bless them, to honor them, to cradle them with cedar and tobacco, and to pray for peace to surround them on the journey of their final resting place. However, when they walked into the room, what they saw was a cardboard box, which was home to their ancestor for more than 50 years, and it was in a box, and it had a single word written on it, skull. So one of the things that this bill doesn't really look at is how are we going to move forward in a respectful way? How are we going to make sure that the remains of loved ones are returned home to their communities? And then when that process happens, it happens in the most thoughtful way possible. The sad reality is the history of Canada is one steeped in colonialism. From the region I represent, many communities are participating to this day in the potlatch system. Mr. Speaker, the potlatch system was a way of redistributing wealth. It was a way of making sure that people were looked after, And this is a very sacred process, and it's one of governance, and I think that's really important. This is not just a celebration. It's a way of governing. It's a way of making sure that there was fairness, that no one was left behind, and that people got to be respected by their generosity. We know that in 1885, when this ceremony was made legal, authorities took items away, including things like totem poles, regalia, and sacred family items. It's hard to explain the impact on the communities. These were the ways that they governed themselves. These were the ways that they dealt with conflict. These were the ways that they acknowledged when people were moving from one phase of their life into another. So it had a huge impact, all of those things being gone. Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about the Numbulese Cultural Centre in my riding, which has done a lot of work in repatriating artifacts to their community. One of the main objectives for them is to recover from other institutions and individuals artifacts and records of cultural, artistic, and historic value for the Kwakwaka'wakw people. This cultural centre has important things. It has activities for schools to educate young people about the history of the area. They have a carving and education centre where they continue to train people on these methods that have been passed down from generation to generation. They work hard around language preservation. And there's also archival footage of in the lower gallery theatre where people can see some of those recordings that were taken so long ago. In 1975, the hereditary and elected chiefs founded the Numbulese Cultural Centre. They did so that they could begin negotiating the return of the potlatch artifacts and regalia. In 1979, the society had things returned, finally home, and several months later opened the doors and allowed their community to come engage with those things, but also encouraged the public to come in and learn more about the history. So it's important today that they continue to do that work and still find things all over the world that are from their cultural territory, and the challenges that they have in trying to get those back. You know, the capacity of many Indigenous communities to store and care for objects is extremely limited. Some museums work very hard to work with the communities to make sure that they have access to these items. You know, recently a community in my riding, Hamalco, took elders and young people to the Royal BC Museum in Victoria, where they saw masks from the late 1800s that were now stored there. They also saw baskets and other things of regalia. And it was a really meaningful moment for those young people to see how long their history was, to understand and see what the masks look like, to interact with the elders, to learn the stories and the things that have been passed down. So it's good to see those relationships happening, but there's so much more that can be done. Professor Jack Loham, Chief Executive Officer of the Royal British Columbia Museum, said the following: "My last issue concerns the slow progress being made toward reconciliation. Our museum displays are still riddled with the stereotypical displays of Indigenous life, emphasizing and privileging white history over Indigenous histories. Repatriation is inadequately funded. Our museum culture is still predominantly white." I understand the intention of this bill, and I appreciate it. It's important work. But I think it's time that in this country of Canada, we start to focus more on the impact rather than the intention. That we talk with Indigenous communities, that we make sure that we recognize the vibrancy in those communities, the history and what it means to them, and what it means when you have the things that were from your ancestors, from your parents' parents' parents, from your loved ones, sitting in a box somewhere far, far away, and that there's no pressure in any way to have those things returned, and what that means to communities when they get those things back home. This is something that is another part of our culture that we have to look at. So I look forward to supporting this bill. I really wish that I saw a little more emphasis on, I understand private member's bill, you can't talk about money, but to make sure that this plan actually has a discussion about that. I saw nothing in there that said there will be a plan that comes forward from this national strategy that will include some of the heavy financial commitments that would have to be made to do this and do this right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.